Jason Monroe stood in the shadow of a nondescript building in downtown Chicago. The cold winter wind brushed against his face as he adjusted the earpiece discreetly tucked into his right ear. His tall, athletic frame blended seamlessly into the crowd, his plain clothes, jeans, a hoodie, and a leather jacket, intentionally chosen to make him appear as just another passerby. But Jason was far from ordinary. A decorated Secret Service agent, he was on a covert operation monitoring a high-profile suspect involved in a cybercrime ring that had been eluding federal authorities for months. The target, a wiry man in his late 30s with a distinct scar across his cheek, had been spotted entering a cafe a block away. Jason's task was simple: confirm the target's presence, report back to his team, and await further instructions. His heart pounded, not with nerves, but with the heightened awareness that came from years of training. Every movement, every sound, every face in the crowd was a piece of the puzzle he constantly analyzed. Jason shifted his position, leaning casually against a streetlight, pretending to check his phone while keeping an eye on the cafe's entrance. It wasn't his first covert operation, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Just as Jason was scanning the street, a commotion erupted a few yards away. A shopkeeper was shouting, pointing at a man sprinting down the sidewalk. The fleeing individual wore a similar leather jacket to Jason's, adding to the confusion. Onlookers parted like waves, their heads turning toward the spectacle. Out of nowhere, Officer Blake appeared. A stocky, middle-aged cop with a reputation for being quick to draw conclusions, Blake was already yelling into his radio. His narrowed eyes locked onto Jason, who was standing still, seemingly an easy target. Blake's perception filtered the situation through a lens of bias. To him, Jason didn't look like someone who belonged in the bustling downtown district. Jason's calm demeanor, athletic build, and darker skin seemed to fit some narrative Blake had unconsciously crafted in his mind. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Blake barked, his hand hovering near his holster as he moved toward Jason. Jason raised an eyebrow but remained composed. His training dictated that staying calm was the best way to de-escalate any situation. "You talking to me?" he asked, his voice steady, though the tension in the air was palpable. Blake didn't answer. Instead, he lunged forward, grabbing Jason by the arm. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them," he ordered. The cop's grip was tight, almost bruising. Jason stiffened, instinctively resisting the rough handling. "Hold on a second," he said firmly, pulling back just enough to regain control of his balance. "You've got the wrong guy. Save it." Blake snapped, his tone dripping with authority. "I'm not falling for that. You match the description of a suspect." Jason's jaw clenched. "What description?" he asked, his voice sharper now. "I'm not resisting, but you need to slow down and think this through." Blake ignored him, shoving Jason against the lamppost. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. Smartphones were drawn like weapons, their cameras trained on the unfolding scene. "I said, hands behind your back." Blake barked, his impatience boiling over. "I'm a federal agent." Jason retorted, his voice rising for the first time. His free hand moved toward the pocket where his badge was stored. That was all it took. Blake misinterpreted the motion, convinced that Jason was reaching for a weapon. With a sharp jab, he struck Jason in the stomach, then followed up with a punch to his jaw. The force of the blow sent Jason reeling, his back slamming against the cold steel of the lamppost. The crowd gasped, and several people shouted protests. "What the hell are you doing?" a woman yelled. "He didn't do anything." Jason recovered quickly, his years of training allowing him to absorb the impact. His eyes blazed with a mix of anger and disbelief as he pulled out his badge and thrust it toward Blake. "Secret Service," he said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Stand down." Blake froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the badge. But instead of apologizing, his expression hardened. "Anyone can flash a fake badge," he muttered, though his voice wavered slightly. He didn't back away. Jason took a step forward, his towering frame making it clear he wasn't intimidated. "Verify it," he said, his tone icy. Call it in. Go ahead. By now, the crowd was fully engaged, their phones capturing every detail. A man in the front row of onlookers spoke up. "Hey, officer, he's telling the truth. Look at his badge." Blake's face turned a deep shade of red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. He hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him admit fault. Instead, he spat out, "You should have identified yourself earlier." Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. He held back the retort that burned in his throat, knowing it wouldn't help the situation. Instead, he squared his shoulders and fixed Blake with a glare that could cut through steel. "I did, and you didn't listen," he said evenly. "You assaulted a federal agent without cause. That's on you." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their collective judgment weighing heavily on Blake. Someone yelled, "He's in the wrong. We got it all on camera." Others chimed in, demanding accountability. Blake turned away, muttering something inaudible as he stalked toward his patrol car. His retreat only fueled the crowd's anger, and Jason could hear snippets of their conversation. Jason took a deep breath, forcing himself to relax his tense muscles. He glanced at the bystanders, offering a nod of gratitude to those who had spoken up. His earpiece crackled to life, and the voice of his team leader brought him back to the mission. "Jason, status update. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jason replied, his voice steady once more. "Minor delay. The target is still in sight." He turned back toward the cafe, his focus sharpening. The mission wasn't over, and Jason knew he couldn't afford to let anger distract him. But deep down, he also knew this encounter would leave a mark, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed it.by the next morning. The incident involving Jason Monroe had become a nationwide sensation. The video of Officer Blake punching a plainclothed Secret Service agent had been uploaded to social media within hours, quickly garnering millions of views. Hashtags like #JusticeForJason, #AccountabilityNow, and #EndRacialBias trended across platforms, dominating timelines and sparking heated discussions. In the video, Jason's calm demeanor contrasted starkly with Officer Blake's aggression. The clip captured every word, every action, and every misstep in crystal-clear detail. Viewers were struck by the moment Jason revealed his badge, only to be dismissed and further antagonized. The visceral nature of the footage made it impossible to ignore, igniting outrage across communities. News outlets wasted no time picking up the story. Major networks aired the video on repeat, dissecting the interaction from every angle. Experts in law enforcement and civil rights appeared on talk shows, debating the deeper implications of the encounter. Anchors asked hard-hitting questions. How could a seasoned officer fail to verify someone's identity before resorting to violence? What role did racial bias play in this incident? Are systemic issues within the police force to blame? Jason, who had spent the night writing his formal complaint, awoke to a barrage of phone calls, emails, and messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers. His superiors at the Secret Service reached out, offering their full support and promising to back him as the situation unfolded. The agency released a public statement condemning the incident and emphasizing the professionalism and integrity Jason had displayed throughout the ordeal. Blake's department, however, found itself in the eye of the storm. The police chief held a press conference, visibly uncomfortable as reporters fired questions at him. "We take these allegations very seriously," he began, his voice shaky under the weight of public scrutiny. "An internal investigation has been launched to determine the facts of the incident. Officer Blake has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." The announcement did little to quell the outrage. Protests erupted in cities across the country, with Jason's name becoming a rallying cry for change. In Chicago, thousands gathered in the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jason, Stop Police Violence, and Protect, Don't Assault." The protesters, diverse in age, race, and background, marched in unity, their chants echoing through the urban canyons. Jason, who had always valued his privacy, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Offers for interviews poured in, but he chose to remain largely silent, letting the formal processes take their course. Still, his composed yet firm demeanor during the incident had already spoken volumes, making him a symbol of resilience and professionalism amidst adversity. Blake, on the other hand, faced mounting backlash. Investigative journalists dug into his record, uncovering a troubling pattern of excessive force complaints and accusations of misconduct. These revelations added fuel to the fire, with activists demanding not only Blake's termination but also a broader overhaul of policing practices. Social media became a battleground. While the overwhelming majority condemned Blake's actions, a vocal minority attempted to defend him, citing the high-pressure nature of law enforcement. Others, however, pointed out that such pressure could not excuse negligence or bias. The discussion evolved into a broader examination of systemic issues within the police force, with Jason's case serving as a flashpoint. As the protests continued, community leaders and activists organized town halls and forums to address the underlying issues. Jason, after much deliberation, decided to attend one of these events. Standing before a packed auditorium, he spoke with quiet conviction. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This is about accountability, about ensuring that everyone, no matter their job, their background, or the color of their skin, is treated with respect and dignity. I'm not here to vilify anyone, but I am here to demand change. Not for myself, but for the countless others who don't have the privilege of a badge or a camera to tell their story." His words were met with thunderous applause, cementing his role as both a victim and a voice for reform. Meanwhile, the investigation into Blake's conduct proceeded. Witness statements, video footage, and Blake's own history painted a damning picture. Public pressure forced the department to expedite the process, and within weeks, the findings were made public. The report concluded that Blake had acted recklessly, failing to follow basic protocols and allowing personal bias to cloud his judgment. The department issued a formal apology to Jason, though the gesture felt hollow in the face of widespread anger. Blake was suspended without pay, pending a disciplinary hearing that many speculated would end his career. But for many, this wasn't enough. Activists continued to push for broader reforms, calling for mandatory bias training, independent oversight of police misconduct, and increased accountability measures. Jason supported these efforts quietly, focusing on his work while lending his name and story to the cause. Months later, as the protests began to wind down, their impact remained undeniable. Several cities, including Chicago, announced new initiatives aimed at improving community police relations. Jason's incident had become a catalyst for change, a painful but necessary step in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. As Jason walked through the same streets where the incident had occurred, he couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet vindication. The scars, both physical and emotional, remained, but so did the hope that his experience might prevent others from enduring the same injustice. And as he returned to his duty, his resolve only strengthened, knowing that his mission extended far beyond any one operation. As the dust settled on the protests, the conversation shifted from the outrage of the moment to the deeper truths lurking beneath the surface. Jason Monroe, the unassuming yet extraordinary Secret Service agent at the heart of the controversy, became the focus of a broader narrative. News outlets dove into his background, uncovering a career that painted a stark contrast to the man who had assaulted him. Jason's record was nothing short of exemplary. Born and raised in Atlanta, he had been drawn to public service from a young age, inspired by the stories of his father, a Vietnam veteran, and his mother, a teacher who championed education for underprivileged kids. After graduating at the top of his class in criminology, Jason joined the Secret Service, where he quickly gained a reputation for his sharp instincts and unshakable composure. Over the years, Jason had played critical roles in numerous high-profile operations. From foiling an attempted cyber attack on a major financial institution to providing close protection for foreign dignitaries during sensitive diplomatic missions, Jason's contributions were widely regarded as vital to national security. His colleagues described him as a man of integrity, someone who embodied the principles of discipline and fairness. "Jason Monroe isn't just a great agent," one former supervisor told a news anchor. "He's the kind of person you want representing this country." As Jason's story gained traction, it stood in stark contrast to the growing revelations about Officer Blake. Investigative reporters dug deep into Blake's past, unearthing a troubling history of misconduct. Over the course of his 15-year career, Blake had faced multiple complaints ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Though most of these complaints had been quietly dismissed or settled out of court, the patterns were undeniable. One report highlighted an incident 5 years earlier, where Blake had been accused of using unnecessary force during a traffic stop involving a black family. Dashcam footage showed him escalating the situation over a minor infraction, though the case never went to trial. Another report revealed that Blake had been involved in a lawsuit where he allegedly detained a Latino man for hours without cause, only for the charges to be dropped due to lack of evidence. The media frenzy only intensified as former colleagues of Blake came forward anonymously, describing a man who was quick to anger and resistant to accountability. One fellow officer recalled, "Blake always had this chip on his shoulder. He didn't take criticism well and had this idea that he was untouchable." Public outrage reached a boiling point as these stories surfaced. Prominent figures, including politicians, civil rights leaders, and celebrities, spoke out in support of Jason and called for systemic reforms. One viral tweet from a well-known activist read, "Jason Monroe represents everything we should value in public service. Officer Blake represents everything we need to fix in law enforcement." The message was retweeted hundreds of thousands of times, becoming a rallying cry for change. Jason, still wary of the media spotlight, chose his appearances carefully. In a rare interview with a respected journalist, he spoke candidly about his experience, his career, and his hope for a future where incidents like his would become a thing of the past. "This isn't about me," he emphasized. "This is about ensuring that the systems in place work for everyone. Accountability isn't just a buzzword, it's the foundation of trust. Without it, no badge, no title, no institution can stand." The interview was lauded for its sincerity and depth, further solidifying Jason as a figure of quiet strength and resilience. Meanwhile, the calls for Blake's removal grew louder. Community leaders demanded not only his termination but also a thorough examination of how someone with his track record had been allowed to remain on the force for so long. Faced with mounting public pressure, the police department was forced to take swift and decisive action. The police chief, already under scrutiny for the department's handling of the case, announced in a somber press conference that Blake had been suspended without pay, pending further action. "We recognize the gravity of this situation," the chief said, his voice strained. "It is clear that mistakes were made, and we are committed to addressing them transparently." The announcement did little to stem the tide of criticism. Activists pointed out that suspension was merely a first step and demanded a comprehensive overhaul of departmental policies. Proposals for independent oversight boards, mandatory de-escalation training, and improved accountability measures gained traction in city council meetings and public forums. As the investigation into Blake's conduct progressed, more damning evidence came to light. Internal memos revealed that several of the complaints against Blake had been quietly flagged as high risk by internal affairs, but no significant action had been taken. The revelation sparked a broader conversation about the culture of silence within law enforcement and the need for greater transparency. Through it all, Jason remained a steady presence. He continued his work with the Secret Service, balancing his professional responsibilities with his growing role as a symbol of reform. Though he hadn't sought the spotlight, he recognized the importance of using his platform to advocate for change. "This isn't just my fight," he said during another public address. "It's a fight for everyone who's ever been overlooked, dismissed, or wronged. And it's a fight worth having." Months later, as the disciplinary hearing for Blake loomed, the focus began to shift toward solutions. Jason's case had become a tipping point, inspiring a wave of reforms in police departments across the country. Training programs were revamped, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and communities began to rebuild trust with the institutions meant to serve them. In the end, the truth didn't just come out, it demanded action. And while Jason would always carry the scars of that day, he also carried the knowledge that his experience had sparked a movement for change, proving that even in the face of injustice, resilience, and integrity could prevail. Months after the incident, Jason Monroe found himself standing on the stage of a packed community center. The air was charged with anticipation as people from all walks of life gathered to hear him speak. Jason had become an unlikely symbol of justice and accountability, not because he sought the spotlight, but because his story resonated with a nation yearning for change. The room was a mix of faces, young and old, activists and community leaders, police officers, and ordinary citizens, all united by a shared desire to create a better system. As Jason stepped forward, the applause was deafening. He adjusted the microphone and looked out over the sea of expectant eyes. "Thank you," he began, his deep voice steady but tinged with humility. "Thank you for being here, for caring, and for taking action. What happened to me wasn't unique, it was a reflection of a system that still has a lot of work to do. But today isn't about anger. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else." Jason's speech was a masterclass in grace under pressure. He spoke about his own journey, about the values instilled in him by his family and his career in the Secret Service, and about the importance of integrity. "Accountability isn't about punishing one person," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about creating a culture where everyone, officers, agents, citizens, feels protected and respected. Without that, we can't move forward." The audience hung on his every word, and when he finished, the standing ovation was thunderous. Jason stayed after the event, shaking hands and listening to stories from community members. Many shared their own encounters with injustice, thanking him for shining a light on the need for change. For Jason, it was a humbling reminder of the responsibility he now carried. Meanwhile, Officer Blake's world was unraveling. The disciplinary hearings were underway, and they were anything but private. The media's relentless coverage ensured that every misstep in Blake's career was laid bare for the world to see. Witnesses from his past cases testified about his pattern of misconduct, painting a damning picture of a man who had abused his authority time and again. Blake himself appeared before the disciplinary board, his once confident demeanor now replaced by a defiant bitterness. "I was just doing my job," he argued, though the evidence against him spoke louder than his words. The video of the incident with Jason, the complaints from civilians, and the testimonies of colleagues created a narrative that was impossible to refute. The hearings were a public spectacle, with protesters gathering outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and accountability for all." The pressure on the police department to take decisive action was immense, and many within the force began to distance themselves from Blake. Former colleagues who had once overlooked his behavior now openly criticized him, realizing that his actions had tarnished the department's reputation. "Blake was a liability," one officer told a reporter anonymously. "We all knew it, but the system protected him. Now, we're all paying the price." The fallout wasn't limited to Blake's professional life. His personal life crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Friends and neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior now saw him in a new light. His name became synonymous with the very issues activists were fighting to dismantle: abuse of power, racial bias, and a lack of accountability. As Blake's world collapsed, Jason's rose to new heights. He was formally recognized by the Secret Service for his exemplary conduct during and after the incident. At a private ceremony attended by his peers, Jason received the agency's Medal of Valor. The director of the Secret Service praised him for his unwavering professionalism and courage in the face of adversity. "Jason Monroe represents the best of what we strive to be," the director said during the ceremony. "His actions remind us that integrity isn't just a word, it's a way of life." Jason's story also inspired broader changes within the Secret Service. The agency implemented new protocols for supporting agents working undercover and introduced mandatory training on de-escalation and handling public altercations. Jason's ordeal became a case study, ensuring that future agents would be better equipped to navigate similar situations. Blake's final disciplinary hearing ended with a resounding verdict. He was terminated from the police force, his badge and weapons stripped away. The department issued a public apology to Jason, though it felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. For Blake, the termination wasn't just the end of his career, it was the collapse of his identity. The community that had once supported Blake as a law enforcement officer now rejected him. His name became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what could happen when power was wielded irresponsibly. Meanwhile, Jason's name became synonymous with resilience and integrity. Schools invited him to speak to students about leadership and justice, while organizations asked him to consult on reform initiatives. Despite the accolades and recognition, Jason remained grounded. He continued his work with the Secret Service, his resolve stronger than ever. For him, the incident with Blake wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. In the end, karma had struck with undeniable force. Blake's downfall was a direct result of his own actions, while Jason's rise was a testament to his character and principles. As Jason walked out of the community center that evening, the applause of the crowd still ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. Justice, he knew, was a journey, not a destination. And he was ready to keep walking that path, no matter how long it took. It had been nearly a year since the fateful day when Jason Monroe, an undercover Secret Service agent, was wrongfully assaulted by Officer Blake. The world had changed dramatically in the wake of the incident, with reforms set in motion and conversations about accountability and bias taking center stage. But for Jason, the journey wasn't just about one incident, it was about creating lasting change. Blake, now a disgraced former officer, had lived through months of public backlash and personal turmoil. The disciplinary hearings had stripped him of his badge, and the media had turned his life into a cautionary tale. The weight of his actions, and their consequences, had become impossible to ignore. With nowhere else to turn, Blake finally broke his silence. In a small, sparsely attended press conference organized by his lawyer, Blake faced the cameras, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation. He stood at a podium, the microphones in front of him amplifying every tremor in his voice. Gone was the defiant officer who had refused to apologize during the incident. In his place stood a man visibly humbled by the events that had unfolded. "I want to start by saying that I was wrong," Blake began, his voice cracking slightly. "My actions on that day were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for them. I allowed my biases and assumptions to cloud my judgment, and I failed to uphold the principles I swore to protect as an officer of the law." Blake paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "To Jason Monroe, I offer my deepest apologies. I failed you, not just as a law enforcement officer, but as a fellow human being. You deserved better, and I will live with the regret of my actions for the rest of my life." The apology was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at redemption, while others dismissed it as too little, too late. For Jason, who watched the press conference from the office of his team leader, the words stirred a complex mix of emotions. He had spent months moving past the anger and frustration of that day, focusing instead on the broader issues that the incident had highlighted. When asked later for a response to Blake's apology, Jason's answer was measured but powerful. "I appreciate the apology," he said during an interview with a local news station. "But this was never about one man or one moment. It's about the systems and structures that allow these moments to happen in the first place. Accountability is important, but so is understanding the root causes and working to fix them." Jason's response resonated deeply with the public, solidifying his reputation as a leader who prioritized progress over blame. He didn't seek revenge or personal vindication, instead, he channeled his energy into something far more meaningful. A new initiative. With the support of his agency, local leaders, and community organizations, Jason spearheaded an initiative called Bridging the Divide, a comprehensive program aimed at improving police-community relations. The initiative focused on 3 core pillars: education, accountability, and collaboration. The education component involved mandatory bias training for law enforcement officers, as well as workshops on cultural competence and de-escalation tactics. Jason worked closely with experts in the field to develop curricula that were both practical and impactful. Education isn't about pointing fingers, Jason explained during a program launch event. It's about giving people the tools to do better. The accountability pillar emphasized transparency and oversight. Jason advocated for the establishment of independent review boards to handle complaints against officers, ensuring that investigations were fair and impartial. He also pushed for body cameras to be standard issue, with strict policies on their use and data management. The collaboration component was perhaps the most ambitious. Jason organized town halls and community forums where residents and officers could engage in open, honest dialogue. These events were designed to humanize both sides, breaking down the barriers of fear and mistrust that had festered for years. One such forum took place in the very neighborhood where Jason's incident had occurred. The room was packed with community members, activists, and police officers, all sitting together in a circle. Jason stood at the center, facilitating the conversation. "Let's start with listening," he said, his calm voice setting the tone. "Not defending, not debating, just listening." The discussions were raw and emotional. Community members shared stories of feeling targeted and dehumanized, while officers spoke about the challenges and pressures of their job. The exchanges weren't always easy, but they were necessary. By the end of the night, there was a sense of cautious hope, a belief that progress, while difficult, was possible. A legacy of change. Jason's initiative quickly gained momentum, attracting national attention and funding from both public and private sectors. Cities across the country began adopting the program, tailoring it to their unique needs. The impact was undeniable. Complaints against officers decreased, community trust improved, and more officers reported feeling supported in their roles. For Jason, the work was deeply fulfilling. Though he remained an active agent with the Secret Service, he dedicated much of his time to bridging the divide. He traveled extensively, meeting with police chiefs, community leaders, and activists, always emphasizing the same message: change isn't easy, but it's worth it. Blake, meanwhile, retreated from the public eye. Though his apology had sparked initial skepticism, he quietly began volunteering with organizations focused on police reform. He avoided the spotlight, choosing instead to contribute in ways that didn't center his redemption, but rather supported the broader cause. Over time, his actions spoke louder than his words, earning a measure of respect from those who had once condemned him. The journey continues. As Jason stood on the steps of a city hall during yet another program launch, he looked out at the diverse crowd gathered before him. There were officers in uniform, community activists with handmade signs, and families who had come simply to show their support. The sight filled him with a profound sense of purpose. "This isn't the end," he said, addressing the crowd. "It's the beginning of something bigger. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey. And together, we're going to keep moving forward." The applause was deafening, but Jason knew the work was far from over. Change, he had learned, wasn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It was about persistence, collaboration, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And as he walked off the stage, surrounded by people committed to that vision, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope.